Bucknutters. It is Thursday, December 21st. I am Dan Rubin. This is the Bucknuts Morning 5 and Change. Usually on Thursdays, you get the dulcet tones of Steve Wiltfong, Director of Recruiting for 24/7 Sports. We had Steve in Tuesday to get a head start on the early signing period. So we got to bring in the man today, the Dean of Ohio State Recruiting, Bill Kurelic, for the day after. Yesterday was the first day of the early signing period. Bill, how are you this fine morning?
Doing well, man. Doing very well, and ready to go for another day. I mean, people forget that was just the first day of the 3-day period. Now, realistically, is there going to be a lot more action in the next 2 days? No, but still, it was the first day, and we'll see what day 2 and day 3 brings. And then, of course, we've got, quote, the real national signing day in February, although now, yesterday was actually the real national signing day. That's when most of the kids will have signed this year.
So uncharted waters on some level here. There's going to be some names of guys who didn't sign that we will get to in a little bit. First, we want to go over what went down yesterday. Obviously, Ohio State ended the day at number 1. They are no longer the number 1 recruiting class. Georgia passed them up. What I want to do today, though, is try and get a perspective of what we think it was like for Ohio State staff to go through yesterday. We know it was like on the front row. We all lived through that. So let's go through the first one. Jackson Carman, take us through kind of what you think of the last vestiges of the Carman recruitment and then kind of how it went down.
Well, I can tell you that he did a very good job of keeping things on the down low. As of Monday afternoon, as of Monday night, and into Tuesday, staffs of those schools did not know where he was going. They had not been told. You hear about sometimes that, a prospect lets these schools know days in advance or whatever. That wasn't the case with Jackson Carman. I can tell you for a fact that the different staffs, were wondering and working on Jackson Carman. And obviously we know he ended up picking Clemson. Looking at it, I think that that was a school that when he visited there really turned his head. But as time progressed, he just seemed to not really talk about them very much, and that's why it surprised a lot of people, including myself. I did not think he was going to go to Clemson, but he did, and that's where he's going to be. Of course, the situation by now with Dabo Sweeney talking about Urban and Meyer and how long he's going to be around and all that. And Jackson admitted that he did listen some to that. Now, was that his deciding factor? Probably not, and I'm sure it was not the deciding factor, but he did mention that happening.
I was actually going to ask you about that. I want to say this in a way that's not taken incorrectly, but that would be a really silly reason for him to make his decision. How much older is Nick Saban than Urban Meyer? It's much longer than the time Jackson Carman was going to be in college. Is that really? I will say this for the record. I do think it maybe it played small factor. I think that is a juicy press conference quote that got blown out of proportion. And I think the kid just said something stupid, but that's just my opinion.
And when you look at negative recruiting, it happens. There's no question it happens. And really, that would be low on the meter as far as what is said and what is said negatively in the recruiting process. A lot worse than that goes on as far as negative recruiting.
Great point. And excuse me, I think further illustrates that was just Carman being enigmatic in front of the crowd, but we shall see. I have a theme about these three guys we're talking about that I'll say at the end, and I'm sure some will say it's sour grapes, and that's fine, but it is Bucknuts. Emory Jones, the quarterback who has been committed here since before I had 3 kids, it feels like, obviously did not pull the trigger down the stretch and is going to Florida. I've said before, if I was a quarterback, the idea of being courted the whole time by other schools and then at the last second choosing Florida to me, would be a little disconcerting. It's not like Ohio State went into yesterday thinking Emory Jones was going to be a Buckeye, correct?
Well, he didn't have the option to pick Ohio State yesterday, or really, as I detailed on an article I wrote, the timeline of everything, he didn't have the option of picking Ohio State from the point that Matthew Baldwin committed to Ohio State. Urban Meyer visited with, and Ryan Day visited with Emory Jones on December 5th, and that was when the last visit was made with him, and he did not shut down his recruiting. And 2 days later, Matthew Baldwin announced the commitment to Ohio State, and from that point on, Ohio State had moved on from him. So, the thought that he turned down Ohio State at the end is just not the way it went down. They had to get a quarterback in this class. They absolutely had to get a quarterback, and Matthew Baldwin is a very good quarterback, and they were able to lock him up. They were able to feel on December 7th that it was 100%. Once he committed, he was going to sign with him, which he did, and that ended, for all intent and purposes, Ohio State 2018 quarterback recruiting, and they got a very good quarterback, in my opinion.
I have to admit, I chucked up a 3-1 fastball for Bill to turn on there. We've obviously learned all that about Emory Jones, so it's very interesting. Another interesting one to finish off the day, and by finish I mean on the West Coast time, Jaden Woodbay took to the dais and could still be talking. He did not thank Meg, which is an issue for someone. Anyway. What's your vibe on Jaden Woodbay going into the day? How did the staff view him? There has been this is not a shock that he decommitted. Maybe that it was to Florida State down the stretch, but what do you think the staff's vibe on Woodbay was going into yesterday and kind of how it all worked out?
Well, they did know during the day yesterday that he was going elsewhere, and of course, Florida State ended up being the choice. That's a situation where that doesn't happen very often in recruiting, and that you hear all these stories that, well, this was my dream school growing up, or that was my dream school growing up, and then that school entering the picture late and getting a product. That doesn't happen very often, but yesterday it did. Woodby had said when Florida State recently offered him a scholarship that was his dream school. For him to go in at the last minute and actually pick that school doesn't happen very often. And obviously it did on Wednesday. Well, I think it was all pretty much Thursday, actually, today, before he finally announced that thing last night. At least it seemed like it. But a situation where he went and visited there. He said it was his dream school, and obviously he didn't lie because he ended up picking Florida State. And as disappointed as Ohio State fans are that happened, there are some USC fans that are pretty disappointed as well because, that's a kid in their backyard that they lost out on at the last minute.
I have no empirical data to back this up, but guys who do this, and I realize this coming from the publisher of Bucknuts is going to sound like sour grapes, and maybe it is slightly, but guys who do this protracted hat dance, I'm going to surprise you at the press conference, I'm not into it. I'm sorry. You're going to hear a lot of negative stuff come out about some of these guys because that's just the nature of the beast, and I don't think we should sully the name of a high school kid, but there's not a doubt in my mind Ohio State will be fine as a program, and these three guys, while talented, are going to be replaced and replaced admirably. Let's get to what comes next. Obviously, the signing period is not over. We have a couple more, 36 more hours left here. Give us an idea of what you expect from the last 36 hours, and then what will happen from here on out in terms of recruiting. Who are maybe the 3 or 4 guys that are still supremely focused on, where they stand, kind of set the course as we go forward here.
It wouldn't surprise me from an Ohio State standpoint if, quote, nothing happened as far as any more signees, but I don't think that's impossible because as I talked about last night in an article I wrote, somebody like Tyler Friday, I can tell you that while he has said he's going to wait till National Signing Day now, I know he has had thoughts of making a decision before the end of this early signing period. Now, again, I'm not predicting he does, but I can tell you that he's had thoughts about that possibility, and he still has today and tomorrow to do that if he wants to do it, and that's one example. So while I don't predict Ohio State to sign anybody else in this 3-day period, it's not totally out of the question. I mean, it could theoretically happen. I just, we'll kind of see how that goes. If they don't sign now, obviously they have to wait until National Signing Day in February, but they can still announce decisions, and we know that 2 outstanding prospects are planning to publicly announce decisions at the Under Armour game, Tyreek Smith and Jason Owe. There were some rumors that maybe Tyreek Smith now had decided he was going to wait until February and National Signing Day to announce, but I checked yesterday with the Tyreek Smith camp, and they said that that's not true, that his plan is still to announce his decision on January 4th at the Under Armour game. And, of course, Jason Owe is planning to do the same thing. And those are 2 great prospects that Ohio State is absolutely very much in the running for. In fact, I would be shocked if Tyreek Smith is not a Buckeye when he makes his announcement.
Is there a chance that, and I guess there has to be, but is there a chance that another new name could pop up between now and the end of the signing period, or the new one coming up? Maybe someone who didn't commit to one of the bigger Power 5 schools that they had an eye on that could get into the mix, or is this pretty much they're going to stay focused on the guys they've been in the mix with to this point?
I think, I don't like to say never in recruiting just because it's recruiting. But, again, I'd be pretty surprised if a new name popped up before the end of the national or the early signing period. I think if there's going to be new names pop up, and I do think there will be, because we've got approximately 6 weeks to go till National Signing Day in February, and in recruiting, 6 weeks is an eternity, especially with this Ohio State staff. Matthew Baldwin, 3 or 4 months ago, he was not on much of anybody's radar screen in terms of Ohio State, and lo and behold, Ohio State had to have a quarterback. He's a good one, and they landed him. This staff is very good at if one option doesn't work out, making another good option work out. So in the next 6 weeks, there's a lot that they can do. There's over 600 unsigned prospects out there, and certainly Ohio State is going to be working. They don't, the positive, as Urban Meyer, I believe, mentioned yesterday, he didn't dream at one point that Ohio State would sign 21 players on the first day of the early signing period. And lo and behold, they signed 21 players. And while they are not ranked currently number 1 in the country, it's the number 2 class in the country. So that goes to show that they've done a pretty darn good job of signing players on the first day of the early signing period.
Just to kind of wrap it up here, how would yesterday kind of affect your overall view of the class?
Well, it's an outstanding class, but it's a class that they need to fill a couple areas still. If you look at the defensive tackle spot, I don't know that they could have even hoped to have done that, what they did, landing the number 1 defensive tackle in the country in Tehran Vincent, the number 1 junior college defensive tackle in the country in Antoine Jackson, and then Tommy Togiai, who they just loved and were elated. Well, if you saw it on the internet, Larry Johnson, Urban Meyer's reaction when he committed, it just tells you how highly they think of him. So, they've landed a spectacular, almost above and beyond what you could have expected, a defensive tackle, as an example. But there are still two big areas that need to be filled. Number one, obviously, defensive end. They don't have any defensive ends in the class right now. If they get 2 out of the 3 guys, which I think is quite possible, Smith, Owe, and Friday, that's going to be a strong area of the class. So that's the big need right now, defensive end, and then offensive line, offensive tackle. You know, they've got Max Ray, who's an outstanding prospect, but they need at least 1, if not 2 guys to go with him. And at the top of the board right now, Rashid Walker and Nicholas Petit-Frere, if they could land one of those 2, and that's possible, you know, that would be outstanding for Ohio State.
There you have it, Bucknutters. Again, the early signing period is not over. It runs through tomorrow, and then we'll get back at it, the Under Armour game, etc. That's the way to put it in perspective. Keep in mind, we are number 2 in the rankings. There's no reason to march on Washington here. Have a good one, Bucknutters.